The right-wing crackdown on trans existence that we're currently witnessing is being fueled by a relentless campaign of dehumanization. And even if anti-trans bigots know that they're not going to be able to turn everyone against trans people, their goal is to at least get enough people to become complacent so that way they can systematically erase them more easier. And I fear that we are kind of reaching that point, but it's not the first time that the US government has waged a war against a marginalized group of people, and it's not even the first time they've done this against the queer community. But one thing that's become apparent over the years is that one of the most powerful tools that we have to fight dehumanization is humanization. And Laverne Cox is one of the most influential individuals doing just that. She is dismantling the big bad trans boogeyman that Republicans have concocted. And I say that because to a lot of Americans, Laverne Cox's character Sophia in Netflix's Orange is the New Black really felt like the first trans person that a lot of Americans ever got to know. And after the show's mainstream success, she was featured on the cover of Time magazine, where they called it the tipping point for trans people in America. But just a decade later, the strides that trans people made to gain visibility started to face real erosion. And it felt like a lot of the social and cultural progress that they had made in the 2010s unraveled, as stories of trans existence were being supplanted by right-wing hysteria over the supposed threat that they pose to society. And in her memoir, Transcendence, she deconstructs the lies told about trans people by right-wingers and talks candidly about the difficulties that she faced growing up as a trans black woman in America. She endured bullying, various forms of queerphobia, racism, conversion therapy, depression, suicidal ideation, sexual assault, harassment. At one point, she even talks about how she lived in an orphanage with her brother Lamar. And after reading her book, I sincerely think that this is one of the most important pieces of queer literature right now, because she sheds light on the needless cruelty that trans people face, and it gives cis people a reference point for what it's like to actually be trans, which is needed now more than ever, so that way cis people can better understand what their trans friends and family are going through. And I had the privilege of actually getting to talk to Laverne Cox about her memoir, and specifically what it was like to grow up as a trans person in America, and to realize who you are before there was any talk of gender nonconformity or just being trans in general. So here are some highlights from our conversation. Throughout the book, you talk about how you were trans and you knew you were trans before anybody even really knew what that was, before you knew what that was. And I really wanted to go back to the childhood moments from the book, because there was a moment that really stood out to me, and it was the fan moment, right? So you talk about how you won this fan from a Six Flags amusement park, and you started to fan yourself.
Actually, I bought it at the gift shop at Six Flags. Yes, but go on.
Oh, gift shop. Okay, yeah. So if I'm remembering correctly, like you were fanning yourself because you saw people doing this on TV shows. They looked really regal, and that moment ended up becoming really significant in your childhood, at least in my interpretation, because something so innocent and cute that you wouldn't really think is problematic was something that led to adults basically bullying you over, and it led to conversion therapy for you. So you talk about how you were in your classroom and you were fanning yourself, and your teacher took you out of the classroom and told you to do it for another teacher to show them how effeminate that was, which is bad, of course. And then they showed another teacher, and then you end up in conversion therapy with this guy who you described as gay as fuck in your book. Can you just talk about that experience? Because I feel like for a lot of queer people, I don't know if this is true for all queer people, there's a moment in their childhood where their essence becomes undeniable, and either they see it or somebody else sees it. I have that moment myself, but like for you, can you just talk about that moment and how it really changed the trajectory of your life and how you viewed yourself at that time?
It was pivotal but it was pivotal because, even the therapy thing, like my mom was a single mother and she worked 4 jobs. We were poor. So like paying for therapy and then being a problem. My mother did not have time for her children to be a problem. She was trying to figure out how to keep the lights on, how to pay the rent, how to put food on the table. And then for me, I started, dancing, tap shoes and art supplies for my brother. So being a problem was not something that was good, that I wanted to be. And there's something kind of, in retrospect, ridiculous about it became a huge family emergency. It became an emergency from my teacher. Like that, I was sitting in class fanning myself like Scarlett O'Hara, and it was a way. It was what I did to kind of disassociate, to kind of like go into my own fantasy world because the world around me wasn't so great. And it literally became this inciting incident that led to me sitting in a therapist's office, him asking me if I knew the difference between a boy and a girl. And I said, there is no difference. And the way I reasoned at the time as an 8-year-old was everyone was telling me I was a boy, but I knew I was a girl. So I was like, well, there must not be any difference. And I didn't know. So I'm like, I'm not a boy. Like I was like, I'm not a boy. So I was like, oh, so there must not be any difference. And then I thought I had doctor-patient privilege, but didn't. He tells my mother, and I just my mother yelling at me in the car ride on the car ride home, and just I mean my so much of my childhood was my mother yelling at me and being very abusive, just sort of unhinged. Like there was an unhinged quality to my mother's anger and wrath. It would, my therapist thinks that my mother may be a narcissist, and so much of what her issues were what people would say about her, because of how I was behaving. And I was a well-behaved student. I made good grades, but I was femme, and so that was a problem. Luckily for me, though, after the third session, the diagnosis, or the not the diagnosis, but the sort of the care that was suggested was injecting me with testosterone to make me more masculine, was the thing that doctor suggested. And luckily for me, my mother thought that was insane. My mother's kind of not into drugs and medicine. When I started medically transitioning, she wasn't into that, as an adult. So luckily that didn't happen. And years later, I was in a support group here in New York City at the LGBTQ Center for Trans Women. And a trans woman shared a story about when she was 12, she went into conversion therapy, and they did inject her with testosterone, copious amounts of testosterone. And so when she finally was time for her to transition, the testosterone had done such a number on her. So feminizing was really, really hard for her. So I feel so lucky that didn't happen to me. But then last year I was doing this, I did a one night only play called The Pansy Craze. It's actually available on Audible right now. And I played a woman named Gladys Bentley, who is a Black lesbian blues singer and pianist who was a superstar during the Harlem Renaissance and during the Pansy Craze. And she wore these male tuxedos, usually white male tuxedos with a top hat. She famously married a white woman. She was openly queer at the time. And she was fabulous. But after the Pansy Craze, she kind of, went out of favor and had to revitalize her career. And many years later, she pops up on the Harpo Marx show in the early 1950s, and she's in a dress and she sings In Their Eyes. And then there's an article in Ebony magazine where she talks about, I think the headline's I'm a Woman Again. And she talks about leaving her sinful ways, finding God, marrying a man. She actually took classes to learn to cook and clean for him. And she was injected with female testosterone, with female hormones. They injected her with estrogen. And this is in the early 1950s. So this is something that doctors were doing for decades as a treatment for gayness and transness. So you're not, so it's for someone who's a gay woman. She did, wear suits. She may have been a little trans, a little gender nonconforming, whatever. But the conflation of sexual orientation and gender identity, it's like, if you're gay, I'm going to inject you with testosterone. If you're a man, and estrogen if you're a woman, and somehow that's going to like correct your gay. It's like it actually makes no sense.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah, There's a
Yeah.
lot of pseudoscience behind it, and there's just a lot of confusion that adults unwilling to acknowledge the existence of queer people like insert into kids. And one moment that stood out to me when you were really young is how you talked about the mixed messages that you got from your mom and from grown-ups who essentially they would always bemoan the kids around the neighborhood because they were hoodlums, but at the same time they wanted you to be more like those kids because the kids were masculine, and it was utterly confusing to you. I remember you describing it that way in the book because you didn't know what they wanted you to be and you were just you. And like one of the takeaways from this book is that if you are trans, like your entire life society subjects you to just this nonstop gaslighting campaign, and it's hard to deal with that, especially when, for you, you're a Gen Xer, and even in your generation there wasn't necessarily language to describe what gender nonconformity was, what transness was, so you were kind of having to navigate this without knowing what this was, or if there was anybody else like this. Can you kind of just talk about how, despite all of the confusion that society, tried to throw into your life about who you were, how you finally found yourself?
It really was moving out of denial. I always knew. Like, I always knew that I was a girl. What happened with the conversion therapy, like before, there's a pre-conversion therapy and a post-conversion. Before conversion therapy, I danced around all the time. I was myself. I was free. I danced. I fanned myself. I just was Laverne. And after the conversion therapy, I was like, I started monitoring my behavior. I started monitoring how I held my hands and how I walked and how I sat. And so I began to kind of try to modulate myself. And I was constantly watching myself, and it was very exhausting. And I wasn't very good at it either. Even as I was monitoring myself, my femme just could not be contained. And it was the shame, the intense sense of shame that developed too after that. And when I talk about shame, I specifically referring to Brene Brown, the way she defines it. She says that guilt is, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, and shame is, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. And so the book is in three parts. The first part is what's wrong with me. Second part is what happened to me. And the third part is what's right with me. And that, like, I deeply internalized that there was something wrong with me, and that the only thing I can do was to become another person to be acceptable. I have to become a completely different person. And so that's what I tried to do. And I disassociated, and then puberty happened, and I just really disassociated. I just left my body completely until I started medical transition at the age of 26. So you can think about how long that was. So there was, I had heard about, like, when she, and to be clear for people, when Miss Ridgway said I would end up in New Orleans wearing a dress, I don't know if you said that part. So that was what she called my mother and said.
Mm-hmm.
That the idea of that in my mind as an 8-year-old was like, I would be some sort of derelict on the street, that I would be homeless and maybe doing sex work and being not being successful, and being just a cultural societal failure, an outcast, a degenerate. And I was a straight A student. I wasn't going to be a degenerate. So that's how this problem of me being so feminine and potentially ending up in New Orleans wearing a dress was like not something that in my 8-year-old mind was a good thing. It was something that would be meant I was a failure, that I was the worst of the worst, is how I internalized that. So I had seen something, I watched Donahue and I watched, Oprah. So there were like trans people on those shows, and I had heard about transsexuality, and I would always watch. I would always lean in, and but I never associated it with who I was, because I would always see, I think the representations were these, I think women, like some of the women were very elegant and smart, but it felt like they were bimbos, or it felt, I don't know, it was just probably my own internalized transphobia. I just didn't connect to any of those talk show trans women that I would see. And so it was just this. So even as I tried to kind of like suppress my femininity, I when I got to high school and I went to the Alabama School of Fine Arts, and I was in a dorm and I was away from my mother, I started exploring my gender more, and I started wearing girls' clothes and women's clothes, not dresses or skirts, and I started wearing makeup. And so I was, we would have I was gender nonconforming. That's the I didn't have that language then, but for me, I was just expressing myself, and I needed desperately to express myself. There was just something. There was a person, I wanted the world to see me. Like I had this desire to not be misrecognized, to not be, I needed people to see me. And so that was what I did. And it was torture the whole time. And if I could have done something more conventional in terms of gender, I would have, because it would certainly make my life easier. But it just didn't. I mean, the turning point really was it was 1997. I went to San Francisco. I was in a car accident. I got a little settlement. I was just really stressed out in New York, waiting tables and trying to survive on tips. And then just the daily harassment that I dealt with. Being gender nonconforming, I think, is probably the worst thing you can be. Like, because for a trans woman, like after I started hormones, some people, I was cis assumed by more people. Like there's always someone who's going to read me as trans, but when you're non-binary and you're visibly assigned male at birth, but like you have a full face of makeup and you're wearing a dress and you have long hair, it is, at least in New York, it was, every day was torture. Walking out of the house, I had to armor up. People would burst out into laughter when I would walk into a bodega or onto a subway car. I was constantly, people would yell, "That's a man, that's a man." And like, it was just, I never felt safe, never. And it was just all of those years of living in New York dealing with that, but then also my whole childhood of like never feeling safe. And so I went to San Francisco in September of 97, and just like to just get away. And I was staying with my brother. He was living there at the time. And like the third night I was there, I like had a nervous breakdown and like shaved my head. And I was like, I'm going to try to be a boy. And it was just too much. It was just like the day to day of like what I had to deal with as a gender nonconforming person was just, I was so exhausted. I was so exhausted from it.
Yeah, you can tell in the book as well that moment was really pivotal. And it was also so hard to read because before that moment, you were finally starting to really embrace who you are, feel more comfortable in your own skin. You had been wearing Salvation Armani, as you described it, thrift clothing that you had kind of fashioned into your own style and whatnot. And, you were doing more things to make you feel comfortable. And at that moment, it was shocking to read because it felt like after you had made so much progress in self-love and accepting yourself, society had effectively bullied you into being something that you're not. And so when I read that particular passage of you shaving your head and having that nervous breakdown, it almost made me tear up because it was really difficult to see how even when you start to really love yourself and embrace who you are, society always has a way of beating you back down. And so that was a significant point in the book. And one thing that was really, just as a cis person, that was shocking to me is even if you start to flirt with gender nonconformity, there are parameters that were put up back then, which isn't that long ago, but there were parameters put up that really made it so that way there were still acceptable ways to be non-conforming. And there was a passage I actually wanted to read.
Yeah, please.
So it was about when you had kind of gotten to know some drag queens. And I just want to read this because I wanted you to kind of like expand on this. So you write, there were some drag queens who felt like you're a boy during the day and then you do drag at night. But if you mixed it like I did, if you were dressed in the daytime or wearing makeup, this was seen as strange. And this was at a time when just being trans was still something that was viewed as taboo. You can dress as a different gender, but you just have to do it only as something that's temporary and fleeting. You can't have that be your permanent identity. And just like, can you talk about the struggles with that? Because that to me was something that was like, as a cis person, I've never had to deal with that. So it was really shocking to read that, because it's just so sad that even when you start to defy norms and, reject the gender binary, there's still so much things that society tells you you have to do to align, even in those circumstances where you're already outside of the
Your
norm.
community. Yeah. I remember not caring. I remember like being really surprised. So by the time, so this was, I was at Indiana University when this had happened, and I had already, I think, read my first Bell Hooks book. And so there was this drag queen who I knew did drag and was like talking shit about me and saying say basically suggesting I was mentally ill or something was wrong with me because I was, wearing makeup and dresses during the day. I kind of thought it was funny, but there was also like an irony of drag queens sort of like dictating. But there are people, there's like trans women who try to police other trans women to this day, and there's like that still exists. And so I thought it was funny. It didn't affect me, but I thought it was important to put in the book because this intra-community conflict or differences of how we should present have always existed and persist. And what I've been saying to people now is that like the fascists actually, they don't even distinguish between you and me. They really do.
Yeah.
Oh, he's gay. Oh, she's okay. All of you go.
They hate us for the same reason. Like, you're born a certain way, you have to meet these expectations.
And that, I wrote a piece for the New York Times, like 15 years ago. And it was because it was a conversation about like, should trans people be a part of the LGBTQ community? None of these things are new. And I talked about like, and I remember talking in the op-ed in the Times about how whether we should be or not, we are, because of the way oppression works. And in the patriarchal imaginary, I love the patriarchal imaginary. You are less of a man if you have sex with another man, and you're less of a man if you are feminized and a woman. So like, there's not like, in the patriarchal imagination, there's like a demasculine, like you're no longer a man if you do certain things. And so the conflation of sexual orientation, gender identity in the patriarchal oppressors' imagination groups us together. And so our fates are like linked, whether it's something different or not, when the oppressor isn't educated around their bigotry, right? Around sex. They're just like, this isn't normal, and we must enforce, rigid gender norms at all costs. And we know that this is a very Western colonial construct, that is indeed a construct and is very Western and is very colonial. And so people who insist on, being anti-trans and enforcing this gender binary model are enforcing a very colonial model that is tied to white supremacy as well as transphobia.
It's all interconnected. And one thing that the way I visualize it is that there's the good, as society would describe it, if you are assigned male at birth. And the further you sway away from that good, which is masculinity, the worse off you are, the more bad you are. Whereas, at that moment with the drag queens in the book, it brought up this idea of, this trope in the gay male community where there was this idea that was derogatory, where it's like no fats, no femmes. I remember this, to where, even if you are within this community, it still exists. Absolutely. Yeah. The health standards and whatnot, or the beauty standards for like queer people, that's a different subject too. But like, even within this community where you should be accepted, there's still expectations because the further you get away from that masculine good, the worse you are perceived. And one thing in the book that really struck me, just as a cis person, is how similar trans people are to cis people in the sense that they just know what their gender is, right? And like I have a trans niece right now, and ever since she was able to make decisions that would be seen as gendered, such as the toys that she likes, the movies that she watches, she chose female. And I did the same thing, albeit as a cis kid. I just always gravitated toward male things. I'm gay, so I have feminine qualities, but it's not necessarily going to be the same thing. And one thing that I've started to notice, and I'm sure you've noticed this too, and I think it's probably more prevalent with UK transphobes, is that there's this pseudo pro-gay, anti-trans talking point that like there's no such thing as trans kids, and the parents of trans kids are essentially misreading what is homosexuality, and they're turning their kids
They're
trans. And
tomboys. They're tomboys. They
yeah,
just
they're tomboys. And to me, that's so frustrating because, like, as somebody who is cis but gay, like you could tell from a really early age that I was different. I didn't know what gay was, but if my parents tried to push me into being trans, if they tried to put me in a dress, I would throw a temper tantrum because I wouldn't feel comfortable in that. And so they genuinely don't see trans people as discovering their gender in the way that cis people do. And I find that so frustrating because like if you read through your book, it's evident that like you were not pushed by no means towards being trans. And there's still this idea in
Right, yeah.
society that like there's no such thing as a trans kid. It's the liberal parents who are hyper progressive who are pushing their kids towards this when it is
Same.
painful
That
to
is
be a trans kid.
for them to come up with that narrative too. It's like no right wing narratives are really usually based in any kind of empirical reality, but
Right.
it's full whole cloth because like the parent like a lot of conservative parents. Debbie Jackson was this amazing woman. I think she's from Mississippi. She was testifying before the state legislature many years ago, and she said, there's a lot of ideas about parents of trans kids that they're liberal. I'm conservative. I'm a Republican. I voted for blah blah blah. That we're atheists. I'm a Christian. Like she was like this Christian conservative woman whose child said that I'm trans, and she had to figure it out. It's not something she was like, okay, let's go. She was like skeptical, and she took the child to the therapist and the doctor. These are things that parents, I know so many parents of trans kids. I don't know any parent who's been like, let's do it. It's like
Right.
pediatrician, therapist, how like is this gonna go away? It's like it's a whole. Then if they are conservative and they have to grapple with it, I met a parent in Seattle. I was in Seattle. She's more, she was liberal, and so she accepted her child, but it wasn't just like okay. It's like doctor, therapist, pediatrician, like how do we, and then if you are wrestling with it, you have to pray, you have to like, none of these things are taken lightly, and the insanity that they're pushing, that people are just that the suggestion that our dementia addled, pedophile, dictator president, that you go to school one day and you get a procedure and you come home. And I'm like, with my girlfriends and I were joking, like, where is that school? Where is that school where you can
We
go?
get free healthcare in America now? What?
Free healthcare and then come out the same day? Girl, like, where's that? I'm like, please tell me. The girls would love to know where this school is, Trop, where you go in the morning and you come out. Like,
Right.
it doesn't work that way. I mean, like, wouldn't that be amazing? Like, honestly, for like the girl, it's like the girls were like, where's that school?
Right. It's agonizing. And a lot of times, and you read about this as well in the book, that, this is not something that your mom took lightly. When you and your brother Lamar were heckled, I believe you were leaving a mall, and, there were these bullies that hurled F slurs at you and your brother. Your mom went home, and then she later was really apoplectic about the fact that, like, oh my God, am I raising these kids wrong? She described it a different way. But, and I remember my mom doing the same thing or saying the same thing to me, even though she accepted me when I had come
How
out.
old were you?
She asked me, what was that?
How old were you when this? Tell me about the moment.
So when I came out, I was 22 years old, and I remember my mom asking me, like, was it anything that I did? She was
Mm.
okay with it by the time I had come out, despite making homophobic comments previously, because that was just the default. But I remember her asking me, like, what was it that I did, in your opinion, or was there anything that I did to make you this way? And it was like, no. And I would, like, recall moments in my childhood where you could really tell that I was very obviously different. Like, there was, much like, you were growing up as well. When you're super young, there's no word to it. Like, kids who are 5 aren't saying, I'm gay, I'm trans. They're just kind of being themselves. And the only difference in
The other
society
kids are
today,
saying things that
exactly,
I mean,
exactly.
I still am gobsmacked at the I like 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds knowing the F slur and knowing sissy. I didn't even know what these words were. So my
Yeah.
first interactions with kids, I'm being called a sissy, I'm being called the F slur, and I don't even like what is it? I didn't even know what it was, but they knew, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
where did they learn it?
And then the one thing though that is different is that parents are no longer basically bullying their own kids. Some parents aren't bullying their own kids. Rather than saying, "Hey, you have to act like a boy, or you have to act like a girl, or don't be a sissy." That's one thing I was told by my dad. That's changed because, like, your kid is just being themselves. Like, we have,
It's
like,
changed
conservatives.
in some families. There's still a lot of, particularly in Black communities, and there's still a lot of this isn't acceptable. There
Right.
have been celebrities who've come out and said I would beat my child if they were gay, and so there is still this. And when you mentioned earlier, like when my mother was like, "You never leave this house," and all the other kids are out there doing this, and you're not normal. Like there are black people, maybe non-black people, but I don't know. But I'm more familiar with my community, who would almost rather you be a criminal and a drug dealer than like trans or gay, and because at least that was like masculine and patriarchal. I mean, the extent to which so many people have internalized some of the most negative aspects of like patriarchy and toxic masculinity is shocking. That they would rather
Yeah.
have a toxically masculine child than a gay or trans child is um, really fucked up for me. To me, I,
Yeah.
I'm anti-patriarchy. I'm like, I'm not. I think these things are very problematic, but
Yeah.
it is telling.
It's
Um,
not just your community too, because I remember somebody who I had come out to had they were really struggling to accept it, and I told them, like, listen, it's not something I'm doing to be like rebellious or anything like that. Like, this is something I struggled with since I started going through puberty, and I even made like this suicide pact with myself to never accept it. And that person later told somebody it would have been better off if he, like, just offed himself. So there really is this idea that, like, being queer is the worst thing that you can be, even worse than being a criminal, because at least you're still straight and normal. You know what I mean? So I resonate with what you say there.
yeah, no, and it's the I'm assuming this isn't a friend anymore. For him to say it would have been better if he had offed himself, that I think that underlies a lot of what is going on in this
Hmm.
country now with as the Limkin, Institute has said, their genocide experts have said that we're on a slow walk towards genocide of trans people. That there are a lot of people who feel like well, if you can't, conform, you should just die, and that is unfortunately a reality. That, like, hate crimes have escalated. We know, according to Trevor Project, that in states that have trans legislation, the bullying of trans kids like escalates like
Yeah.
exponentially, because I mean it's sanctioned by the state. So like people feel emboldened to be even more transphobic. Children, and obviously the whole country, it feels emboldened to be intensely transphobic. It's like it's like the way that we're just such a joke. They'll just like, oh, trans this, men, men and women sports. We believe. I mean, it's just such a like, and it's like it's kind of the laziest political argument.
Yeah.
From conservatives, it's like evoking trans people as some like, as we're just like it's just deeply dehumanizing. How successfully they've dehumanized us is something to study. It really is something to study, because it is probably because we're such a small portion of the population. I think the sports question, that sports was the Trojan horse, because bathrooms didn't work. But I think the fairness in sports, but then even the language they use, men and girls sports, that evokes that imagery. Is like a grown man, someone like you, in girls sports. And that is intentional. That is deeply dehumanizing. Gender ideology. I don't know any trans people who use the term gender ideology. That is a turf, like, that's turf language. But I'm not an ideology. I'm a human being.
Right.
Gender ideology. I mean, gender experts, Judith Butler, people who've written about gender extensively don't use the term gender ideology. It's gender studies, but gender ideology. But it's a great way to stigmatize and dehumanize us. So we're not even people. We're an ideology. We are mentally ill. We are. I mean, that Supreme Court case when I was on the trans sports, when, oh my God, the Solicitor General dude, and the oral arguments was like, biological men who believe that they're women, like language like that goes a long way to just like deny the manhood of trans men and the womanhood of trans women, a female identifying male, like this crazy language to just make us not the human beings that we are. And then in that dehumanization, because there was a period that's been around a long time when trans issues used to be discussed, they would invite trans people on to actually have those conversations on an MSNBC or a CNN or HLN when that existed. But now they don't, and people feel emboldened. I was even watching a Breaking Point with Crystal and Sagler, and I love Crystal. That they were talking about and trying to be reasonable, but they were talking about trans folks. No trans person there, and then I think Crystal said, well, children transitioning is something that can be debated and something that we should discuss. And I was just sort of like, why? Do you have a trans kid? Are you a doctor? Are you the parent? Are you the trans kid yourself? Why is it your fucking business? It's actually none of your business. The fact that like that everybody feels like they can debate whether the healthcare, if a child had cancer or some other health condition, and there were board certified, protocols and procedures that were in place to save that kid's life, to treat that cancer, to treat that, diabetes, whatever it is, people wouldn't be going on CNN and debating whether we should treat the kid with cancer. They would say, like, go to the doctor and like, let the doctors handle it. But with trans people, because somehow, and it's like, I hate the language of culture war. I hate it. And because it's not like, I guess for them it's a culture war, but for me it's about my civil rights. Like, it's not a culture war for me when I don't drive, but if my driver's license is invalidated overnight and I can't get an ID that reflects my gender identity, like, that's not a culture war. That's like a civil rights issue. And ID documents are actually supposed to identify who you are. When the Passport Bureau in the 1970s changed the law allowing trans people to change their passports with a surgery requirement. So, I mean, it's like they weren't so progressive in the 70s. What you had to do back in the day is you would get a temporary passport for a year. pending surgery. And that assumed that every trans person was going to have surgery, which every trans person doesn't. And I'll never forget being at the Callan-Lorde Community Health Center in the early 2000s. And I was in the waiting room, and a trans woman, I didn't realize she was trans actually, but this woman sits down next to me and she tells me she's trans. And she was singing with a gospel group, and they had a gig overseas, and her temporary passport had expired, but she hadn't had surgery. And so she was trying to get a doctor to say she had surgery so she can get a passport, and no one in the gospel group knew that she was trans, right? So this is 2005. So like her traveling, if she had gotten a passport that said male, no one knows that she's trans. Like the safety issues and I know other trans women I met back in the day, she wasn't able to change her passport to female, so she was traveling internationally, and it said male, and she was like, I'm trans, and they were like, what? We don't know. What are you talking about? And she ended up being strip searched, and then they let her in. But these are the things that happen when we don't have ID documents that reflect who we are. And then, God forbid, you're in a country where being trans is illegal and they kill us for being trans, and you need to go there for whatever reason, and you don't have an ID document that reflects that. That's just one thing. But access to another thing they're doing is trying to get the records of trans people from healthcare providers. They're trying to get records of everyone who's trans, kids and adults, and it's a list. And I'm like, this is supposed to be private, but it's also, when you look at what's happened in Cleveland, I think you covered it, but the Cleveland clinic basically capitulated to the administration and closed their gender transition clinic, closed it, paid a fine of like $300,000 to the federal government. And then the federal government's like, that's not enough. So they are now committed to opening a detransition clinic in Cleveland, a detransition clinic. And we know statistically that it's like less than 1% of trans people actually detransition. So like, where are you going to find
a higher regret rate for knee surgery?
I mean, exactly. So are we forcibly detransitioning people? And the answer is yes. They're already doing it in prisons now, right? So the Prison Rape Elimination Act and other policies that have existed over the years have basically stated that when you're incarcerated, that you are entitled to medical care. Just because you are incarcerated does not mean that you should not get medical care. And if you are trans and you are, being treated for that, if you're getting estrogen or testosterone or whatever, that treatment has to continue. That's the law. Anyone with a health condition has to have their they have to be treated medically. It's cruel and unusual punishment. It's a violation of the 8th Amendment if you don't. And so how sad it was in 2019 when Kamala Harris was asked about this, people who are undocumented and who were seeking refugee status, who were trans, who were being treated, and she did say, I will follow the law, but that, people need a little more, that it's actually anyone with a medical condition in prison, they're still human beings too, and they deserve health care. And trans people are human beings, and we deserve access to health care. But now, and under this regime, we are hearing stories about people being forcibly detransitioned in prison. And what a lot of these the bathroom bans, for example, do now, couldn't pass them, but now like 9 states have bathroom bans. It's probably more. These bans criminalize trans people, right? And we've been criminalized before. Cross-dressing used to be illegal. So we had to be wearing 3 articles of clothing associated with the gender you were assigned at birth, or you would be arrested. So trans people were routinely arrested. Cross-dressers, drag queens, trans people were routinely arrested. These anti-cross-dressing laws started right after the Civil War. there were a lot of women who actually fought in the Civil War as men and continued to live as men afterwards. And so there was just this desire to enforce gender. And so the anti-cross-dressing laws sort of emerged after the Civil War. And that's how we know a lot of our trans history, from arrest records, actually.
Wow.
I find that interesting. But so we've been criminalized before. And so you criminalize a population of people. And then we know, just from like, you know, the new Jim Crow, is when you criminalize people, then you can detransition them. We understand like that there were trans people and gay people in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And incarceration is a way to control bodies, labor. So it is part of a larger project. Denying us medical care. The sports conversation. That's just such. Laverne is on a rant now. That's such a there's such a non-issue. It's like the way Republicans act, you would think that there was like, you know, 1 million trans women who've completely overtaken women's sports. And it is an epidemic that we must pass laws right now to ban trans women and girls from sports. And you would think that it was some kind of emergency based on how many of these bills. I think it's like over half the country right now. Mm-hmm. Now it'll be federal, probably with the Supreme Court case. But like 27 states, and they've done it with a swiftness to pass these laws. And we know in many states, this lives rent free in my brain. You should do this insert. Stephanie Ruhle was interviewing the governor of West Virginia many years ago, and he had just signed a bill banning trans girls from sports. And, you know, he's like, you know, we can't have someone take advantage. And Stephanie Ruhle's like, oh, well, you know, do you have an example of someone in West Virginia who's like taking advantage? And you know, and he's like, well, no, I don't. He has to say, no, I don't.
Can you give me one example of a transgender child trying to get an unfair advantage? Just one in your state. You signed a bill about it.
No, I can't really tell you one, but I can tell you this, Stephanie. I'm a coach.
Sir, you have no examples of this happening. Why would you take your time to do this? Let's talk about other things that I can give you examples of in your state. According to U.S. News and World Report, West Virginia ranks 45th in education, 47th in healthcare, 48th on the economy, and 50th in infrastructure. If you cannot name one single example for me of a child doing this, why would you make this a priority? I just named 4 things that would seem to me like a much bigger priority.
That is the case in most of these states. I mean, I think Fisher Wells, who is I think she was was it Kentucky where Fisher?
Yeah, she was the one known trans athlete in the entire state of Kentucky. Yeah.
And she was the one, it was her field hockey team. She was the one who reconstituted the girls' field hockey team. They didn't have a team, and she wanted to play field hockey. She went and found girls who was like, you want to play field hockey? She got the team together. They were practicing, and they were finally ready to do their first match. And then she was told she couldn't play. And so I think she was 12. This breaks my heart. She's like a 12-year-old girl, poised, testifying before the state legislature, saying, I just want to play sports, you know, and I don't think the team was good. It's a team sport. She's not like dominating it. So she just wanted to play with her friends, and they banned her. The one trans girl in the state that they knew of banned her, wrote a whole law for one girl. It
speaks to how unserious these people really are. And it's when you go back to like 2022, 2023, I'm sure you remember this too. There was I think it was AP that posted this analysis, but they spoke to like 20 somewhat attorneys general throughout the country, and not a single one of them could provide an example of trans athletes that they wanted to ban. And the researchers who have looked into this, they have found 5 known trans athletes at the K through 12 level across the entire country. And at the collegiate level, it's around 100. But like, if you look at where most of these stories are focused, when you can find an anecdote, it's at the elementary level. You know, you think high school sports, it's just 5. So, I mean, like, is it really worthwhile to legislate against the 5 trans athletes in the country? They think yes, because, it's not necessarily about them. As you said, it was a Trojan horse for them. Like, the goal is to at least get people to find some entry point to where transphobia will be acceptable. And once you get them, you hook them, and then maybe they'll be more open to bathroom bans.
It was a brilliant strategy. They focus tested it. They are so well funded.
It was.
They focus tested it. It was a brilliant strategy, because then it's like, well, this trans thing has gone too far. They're taking it too far. And so then it's a brilliant way to dehumanize us. This is, I didn't want to talk about sports for a long time, because people like will get in the, you'll see a Joe Rogan getting the weeds about like male puberty and our joints being bigger, or our bones being bigger. So you're already reducing trans people to like testosterone levels, joints, and bones, bone structure. So it's objectifying and by nature dehumanizing. So it's a perfect dehumanization tool. And then so people are not seeing us as human, and then we have to protect the children. We have to protect the children, the old trope.
Every single time.
What's really going on is that I really believe a few things. Trans people are the solution, right? I believe we're actually the solution. If we can be assigned a certain gender at birth, understand that we're not that, and make a decision to live authentically and to define gender on our own terms, everybody can do it. That is a fundamental threat to cis hetero patriarchal structures. Is a fundamental threat to that, because women can make and it's really about controlling women. We don't hear about trans men, right? Unless, I mean, like Matt Walsh, like he wants them detransitioned so if they're white, so they can have babies.
Right.
And I think what I find really interesting with like so many of the Republican, because there are some. I mean, when Dylan Mulvaney was getting all of the vitriol and that she was getting, and other trans women, they were all white. There was even Dave Chappelle, like every time he talks about trans people, they're always white, because if he acknowledges that Black trans people exist, every argument he makes falls apart, because all of his arguments are about like trans people, gay people getting rights before Black people. Like that's his thing. And talking about Caitlyn Jenner's privilege, that all falls apart when you acknowledge that like there are Black trans people. So this is always racialized. And speaking of which, all of these anti-trans policies disproportionately hurt women, cis women. Just we know this empirically, we know it statistically, and we know it in sports. Black women have always been accused of being men in sports, and the genetic testing that they're now doing in the Olympics that they realized in the late 90s was detrimental to women. They've brought it back in this anti-trans panic. And it's not, and in the 22 years that trans women have been allowed to compete in the Olympics, how many trans women have competed in the Olympics? One, sort of. This Laura Hubbard woman, she's Australian, she was a weightlifter. She made it to qualifying, but didn't make it past qualifying. So I don't even know if that counts as like actually competing. So this is like a very generous, so in 22 years, like we've been able to compete in the Olympics, and there hasn't been a trans woman. There have been some non-binary athletes who were assigned female at birth who've competed, but no trans women who've competed in the Olympics. And now there's data. I don't like to get into the data because it feels irrelevant, but now there's data because we actually are studying trans women. There's so few actual studies that had decent sample sizes, because I went on this deep dive, that had decent sample sizes that actually looked at needing enough trans women who were actually athletic, and we exist, but it's not like a lot of us, who were athletic pre-transition and then post-transition. There weren't big enough sample sizes, but now some of the new research suggests that actually for trans women having bigger frames and being on estrogen can actually put us at disadvantages in certain sports. It all depends on the sport, because we have these bigger frames that we don't have the energy to accommodate with our estrogen levels. My estrogen, my testosterone is like minuscule. So it's all, I hate getting into the science of it, but it's like, it's all ridiculous because ultimately what it does is it's another roundabout way to police all women, to like, if you're not woman enough, so then all of a sudden, like, if you're a woman who's a little butch, you cut your hair. Like there was a kid a girl in high soccer or something in like the Midwest who had just cut her hair, and a grandfather were in the stands like, that's a boy, that's a boy, that's a boy.
Right.
They're out of control. And then like she had just cut her hair. So there's this girl, like, this is just all so unnecessary, but it becomes a way to police gender. This is how this is the one way to be a woman, and like putting people in their roles. It puts more women of color at risk in sports and makes their lives more difficult. In bathrooms, more women are being accosted cis women are being accosted in bathrooms than trans women, when people are like, have been, these bounties that have been given out to like, go and find trans women in bathrooms and report them. It's never actually a trans woman. I haven't seen a video of an actual trans woman. I've seen multiple videos go viral of butch or masculine cis women like being accosted in the bathroom. So all of this. So it's like in these, and then it's also important to know, I think that I don't know, I think this trans sports case that the Supreme Court that decision is going to come down. I'm assuming they're going to ban trans girls from sports. And I don't know if you followed that case, but the way they argued it was so narrow that basically it was like this one girl, the category of trans woman that ACLU and Lamb Legal were arguing is a trans woman who's medically transitioned and reduced her testosterone levels to a certain point so that she doesn't have an advantage, right? Because the science actually proves that she doesn't if she has suppressed her testosterone to a certain level. So it was that narrow. So the solicitor was, so if a man didn't take testosterone, but like didn't take estrogen, but declared that he was a woman, would this apply to him? No, it wouldn't. If they were not, it was very narrowly. So it's not even. So it's a very narrow argument that they made, which was smart. But there was one point, if you listen to oral arguments, where the Solicitor General, the very transphobic, said that called estrogen a performance enhancing drug. That like if a man takes estrogen, he's still a man and he shouldn't be competing against women. And it's the insistence. It really is like, I've said this for years, but that the idea that like what you're assigned at birth is always and only what you will ever be, that you can never, that basically that trans people don't exist, but it also suggests that intersex people don't exist, which is
right.
It's just insanity. And it's the bigotry. I mean, we're a good scapegoat, right? But also we're a good scapegoat for a lot of reasons, but we are also part of the Christian nationalist agenda of like getting men and women in their place, right? Like it's part of a larger project.